Welcome back to another session today. I would like to talk to you regarding the conversation about depression, but more particularly addressing the whole question about who you are. I I have been surprised and rather perplexed, if I have to say, with how people identify themselves. There are people who I have met and who, in the first few sentences of describing who they are, they make it known that they have ADHD, some other acronym with letters um, that identify themselves by their behaviors, their preferences, sexual or otherwise, their gonads or gametes, if I can use that word, or they define themselves by their profession. Now, we can define ourselves however we choose to, and there's nothing wrong particularly with how you define yourself. For some of us, we define ourselves as husbands or wives, brothers or sisters, fathers or sons, daughters, business people, investors, accountants. You might even say I'm a sports therapist. It might be even by your hobbies. The issue is not necessarily the categorization under which you define yourself. The question really is, um, does that definition limit you or does it liberate you? I have said in sessions prior that definitions are important because, generally speaking, we understand this from theology and we understand this from science. Whatever places or whatever you are defined by places limits on you by said definition. Let me say that again, perhaps in a more direct manner. You were defined by the placement you put on your shoulders or on your head. Whatever you define yourself by, or whatever defines you, or however you were defined and you accept, by virtue of said definition, there is a limit placed on you. And one of the things I tend to recommend to people is be careful about how you define your identity. This is the reason why in the sessions, in the second segment of this series, I spent some sessions addressing the whole idea of the self-image, the self-identity, self-concept, self-worth, self-assurance, self-importance, self-esteem, self-confidence. It all stems from self. It comes from who you are. No one can make you feel inferior or superior without your consent. The reason we say self before confidence or self before identity is because it comes from the individual. However, we inherit sometimes that picture of self, that definition of self. For some of us, it's societal, social, familial, or individual. And wherever we define ourselves by, if it is not consistent with our true self, you have a conflict. In the session prior, I started by addressing the fruits of the Spirit: kindness, gentleness, self-control, faithfulness, goodness, love, joy, peace, and forbearance. These are all fruits of the Spirit. At your true essence, you find actually that peace and gentleness tend to go together. Peace and faithfulness, love, kindness are all, you might say, different shades of the rainbow. Where one color merges with the other, it becomes very hard to separate one color from another. Those are your fruits. But if we define ourselves in a particular way that is very different to our true essence and our true nature, we then place limits on who we are. For most people, and especially people who suffer from depression, the definitions we give ourselves, the identity we assign or subscribe to, is purely on the physical. We see ourselves as limited. Now, sessions prior, I talked about limitations and limits. One is psychological, one is physical. And for most people, I use an example of a diagram. Perhaps this is a useful way of addressing this, which is you have this diagram, and let's assume what I've just drawn there is a circle. Does that circle represent your real limits? We then have what we call self-imposed limits. And we tend to find that our self-imposed limits are are much more narrow than our real limits or limitations. And for the average person, what you find is that your real limits and limitations are much wider if you define yourself in a certain way. But internally, the self-imposed limitations by what people have said to us, by what we've achieved in terms of our results, by association, by environment, by social policies, tends to be much more narrow. For those who live an abundant life, and a life that is void of depression and anxiety, yes, we all get anxious every now and then, but we don't live there. I do. I don't live there. I have fear, but I don't live in fear. I have worry, but I don't dwell in worry. Worry is the wrong use of the imagination. But for most people, they impose limitations by virtue of what they accept for themselves. And what we try to do, and what I'm trying to do in this series of sessions, is to try and say, no, you're putting yourself in chains. No one has done it, but you have done it. And if we can get you to move back to the original line, and hopefully even expand that line, then that is the abundant life. That is you flourishing. That is the spirit expressing itself through you and with you. And until you start that journey, you find actually that it's almost like a self-perpetuating a circle that continues to shrink. And this continues to shrink until it gets to a position whereby some people say, well, do you know what? I've had enough of this life. I want out. Identity matters. Now, the question really is, why have I started to address this in today's session? There's a reason. I'm going to bounce around in this segment of this conversation about depression, and I apologize for that. And maybe part of the reason is because I haven't sat down and formulated my thoughts carefully and made it into a sequential flow to make life easy. No, the ideas come into my head and I share them. Some of them may be said very poorly, and some of them may be said wisely. It doesn't really matter. Take like a buffet, take what works for you and apply them. Many years ago, I came into the understanding that questions that really define and determine the quality of your lives. The quality of our lives individually is based on the quality of the questions that we ask. And therefore, we should be asking questions relentlessly, without shame, without apologies, but with curiosity and with passion and with this sense of personal growth and development. But there are so many questions that really connect at the core to what we call the good life. I'll share a few of those, about 5, 6 that I'll share in this session, and perhaps I might build on that if it's perhaps appropriate in the sessions that follow. I have been talking about identity, and at the core of that question of identity is the question, who am I? And a lot of people define themselves in a manner that I wouldn't even define my worst enemy as. We speak to ourselves in a manner that even our worst enemies will look at us and think, I can't believe they are saying that about themselves. For some reason, we talk so poorly about ourselves. Who am I? It's a question of identity. And therefore, if you have depression, it means you have accepted an identity of a person with depression. Who are you? That is the question of the ages. Now, 2 sessions prior, or 3 sessions prior, I can't really remember, I made an introduction to the whole idea of purpose. In other words, that there is a reason. This is not just an accident. There hasn't been a big bang and suddenly you've appeared. There's been a careful reason for you being here and being alive. And if you are watching this and listening to this, that is proof. It wasn't just a coincidence. Yes, maybe there were a series of steps that led you to the video or to myself, but there's a core purpose for your life. And purpose addresses the question, why? Why am I here? What was I born for? Mark Twain talks about the most important days of your life, the day you were born and the day you understand why. The second question is one of purpose. Who am I? But I have been addressing in today's session the question about identity. And that is connected to the question of purpose, which is who am I? Why am I here is purpose. Who am I is identity. And for many people, most people say, I don't know why I'm here. but my identity is someone who is struggling and is not happy and is depressed and is anxious and doesn't see life as having any hope or meaning despite all of its suffering, which I acknowledge. And what you tend to find is that if you cannot understand or accept that there's a purpose to life, and there could be, and I believe this to be true, that there is a purpose to everything, despite us being ignorant to the actual reason. If you can accept that there's a purpose behind your challenges and your struggles and your suffering, then that should give you a peace, some peace that makes you realize if there is a purpose, then it also means that there is potentially a divine order that is working in a manner that will surprise you positively, not negatively, but positively. Also accepting the fact that there's a question about self, who am I, and your identity, which is perhaps what we mostly struggle with. Life is all about trying to understand whether my identity is changing. Is the idea correct? But there's a third question, which is important, which is for a lot of people, and I'm going to address this in this session because I think for many people, sadly, they take the way out. A week or two ago, I made reference to someone who had jumped from a bridge onto the motorway, caused a significant disruption to so many people's lives. I feel sorry for the family. My condolences go to the family. Sadly, this wasn't a case of, it was a man, going back to the whole conversation I started with in the prior session about death and men killing themselves. In taking his life, he did so in a manner, I hate to use this word, but that was selfish. I'm going to say a few things that would perhaps irritate and annoy a number of people. I offer no apologies because that is what I think and I believe. Doesn't mean I'm not wrong. There is no right way to end your life. There is no right way to take your life. I also think that there is a wrong way to take your life. Now you might be thinking, that doesn't make sense. There is no right way to commit suicide, but there is a wrong way to commit suicide. Fundamentally, as part of my worldview, I think that there is something sacred about life. And if you understand the duty and the role you play in this life, and the purpose for which you're here, that in your suffering you can find some peace and recognize that the burden placed on you would not be overburdensome. And the yoke you're carrying should be yours to bear and not too heavy. And even if you're carrying a yoke that is beyond you, the great writers say, well, that was not what's designed for you. You're carrying a yoke that is too heavy and you should take it off your shoulders and put on your neck your yoke. And so for many people who have actually suffered from depression and lost loved ones, this might be difficult to understand and accept. There is no right way to end your life because I think life is sacred. That might be down to my own moral philosophy. I'm not suggesting it's superior to yours, but I think life is sacred. I also think that there's something beyond this life. And if you don't think that there is, then perhaps you would be perhaps forgiven in some parts if you believe, well, I may as well just stop this now and stop and end the suffering and start anew. The only issue is that you don't know what the next new will be. Do you repeat the whole process again because you did not complete the test? Like taking an exam, you fail the test. You don't fail the test intentionally so that you move away from that class. You have to repeat the test until you pass the test and then you move on to the next stage. So we are moving through this journey of life. But there is no right way to kill yourself or to commit suicide. There is a wrong way. And I use this as the experience relating to the encounter that I described, which I have some connection with. The man who committed suicide by jumping off a bridge, in doing so, achieved his goal, which was to stop his suffering. Unfortunately, by doing it in such a calloused way, and in a wrong way, by jumping off a motorway when there were oncoming cars, meant that the driver who was involved, perhaps by virtue of the impact of the surprise and the shock, also died. They didn't have to die. If the first person wanted to take his life, by all means, if it's their right to do so, they could have done that quietly. But by being selfish, which is what really suicide really gets to, is this a selfishness, and something I will address perhaps before this whole series ends. This is selfishness to suicide, because in many ways you're saying F you to the world. You're saying to those who actually will suffer in your absence, I hope you feel the pain that I have felt. Because really, to be very fair, although there's no right way to take your life, if you wanted to do it, you could do it discreetly. You wouldn't do it in a manner that actually harms and affects the lives of other people for years to come. Another person died by virtue, and several people were injured by the accident on a motorway. People driving very fast. The driver, the first impact, losing his life. The others getting injured, and then the rest, who was stuck for over 6 hours for the roads to be cleared. But that's not even the issue. It's the medical professionals who did a fantastic job in collecting the remains of the dead people, who were traumatized and who would have to live with what they saw and the experiences. And this is simply because one person decided, I want out. But rather than taking themselves out quietly, they did so in a manner that ended the lives of other people and shattered the lives of the people that experienced and witnessed it. And so I would say this again: there is no right way to end your life. There is a wrong way and a wrong methodology with how you go about their actions. In any case, let me come back to what I was trying to get at, which is, we started with purpose. Why am I here? We've been addressing identity. Who am I? But the next question is actually, where am I going? I said, what is after this life? When you suffer from depression, one of the reasons people take medication, sometimes correctly, and sometimes when they overindulge with intent to take their lives, is that there has to be a hope, a belief that there's something beyond. That thing beyond could just be emptiness or the end. But in as much as you have a belief that there is an end, it means that you believe actually you can turn the page. And the question for many people, if you suffer from depression, is to think about life as follows. Whether you believe in a transcendental, or you believe in something, a life after this life, you inherently think or believe that something happens at the end. There is a finish line. And whether that finish line starts a new line or just stays as end, does exist. And so in dealing with where am I going, that question in itself can allow you to live a much better life and to live life to the fullest if you choose a particular perspective or worldview. This is where we bring in the intellect into the picture. For some people, a coin has one side. Some other people, that's all they think, one coin this side and the other two sides. And for a third group of people, three sides: heads, tails, edge. And if you have the right perspective, which is how you use your intellectual faculties of perspective or perception, you can start to see and assume. You don't have to know, but you can assume in good faith that there is something at the end. And therefore, if you can create this philosophical underpinning which says, if this is a grade that I'm supposed to graduate with, and at the end there'll be a score, then it makes sense to assume that you have to pass this grade in order to complete the test and trials or the adventure of life. And one of the ways you do that is by simply saying, well, I'll do the most honorable thing. I didn't give myself life, therefore I will not take my own life. I didn't give myself life, therefore I will not take the life of other people. As a matter of fact, this temple I've been given, called the body, was gifted to me. I didn't create, design, or earn it. Even though it might have flaws and defects and all of that, I will preserve and look after this because it's the only one body that I have. By choosing the approach that simply says, I will see this to the end, what you've simply said is, I will not take the way out. The way out would be the natural way out. It wouldn't be the artificial way out. And depression is simply a pathway towards the artificial way out. And for most people, it starts very, very, very subtly. And I talked about the virtues that we should have as humans and the fruits of the Spirit. And what we tend to find is that if you go that deep down into the seven deadly sins, we all have an aspect of that. At different forms, stages of our lives, we all have some of it. The question is it ruling you? Is it controlling you? In your case, is it envy or greed? Seeing other people flourish, being on Instagram, and actually constantly looking at yourself as lacking something that you really have, and therefore starting to hate who you are, being critical of who you are, creating an anxiety that feeds on itself, and it leading to depression. You have to start with, who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? Now, I'm going to end today's session here because in the session that follows, I am going to try and expand on this concept with a few other questions. Suffering, for most people, is a choice. Very difficult concept to accept. Suffering, for most people, is a choice. Some of us suffer, many don't. I bet if you met Mother Teresa before she died, despite all of her hardship, she would tell you, I wasn't suffering. Yeah, things were difficult, things were hard, but I was not suffering. The reason partly she would say that is because she believed that she had a purpose, that there was something after this life, and therefore she had a destination. She also believed that she had an identity, and that identity was perhaps rooted in, and had a duty embedded within it. And that duty was supposed to be espoused by the virtues that she had, the fruits of the Spirit, and therefore she was kind and forgiving and peaceful and loving and more. You have to ask yourself some of these questions, because if you can't deal with the questions, you will find that the TV, the radio, social media is telling you every day that there is no value to your life and that your life has no meaning and that life is just a random event. And when you get tired of this journey, just exit stage left or right, and you will start to doubt who you really are at the core. You will start to find things you're not happy with. In other words, you'll point to the heavens and you will wave your fingers and say, this is not fair. And in trying to seek fairness, you would take steps that you need not and should not take. Now, I hope today's session has been useful.